Now that you know about the principles of Neoclassicism, I wanted to show you what we consider some of the major works. So I'm going to start out here with paintings and then move forward through some other types of mediums as well. And here, who's here again for you, right? Here's David again. Because again, as I mentioned, David is really considered one of the most prominent neoclassical painters of this time. And this work is probably considered his most famous work, The Oath of the Horatii, or you often hear, sometimes it pronounced the Horatii. I think it's really how you learn to pronounce the word more than which one is correct. So Horatii, Horatii, whichever one you'd like to use. And this story deals with the conflict between Rome and Alba. So this is a Roman story, unlike the death of Socrates, which was a Greek story. But notice, Greco-Roman, you can use either. In this story, Rome and the city-state of Alba, they kept fighting each other, but nobody was coming out the clear winner of these battles. And so it was decided that they would do like a battle royale. They would pick their 3 best warriors and they'd send them into battle against one another. And whoever won, whoever was left standing essentially, would be proclaimed the victor. And then either Rome or Alba would take the title and the fighting would cease. So it's kind of a stalemate in a sense. So what you're seeing here, the Horatii or the Horatii brothers, who have been selected to protect or defend Rome, and they're taking their oath on their father's swords. So the man in the center is their father, and he holds the swords aloft, and they are swearing their allegiance to their family and their city-state in a sense before they go off to battle. Now think about all the neoclassical things we talked about. This is dedication, it's potential sacrifice, and it's all being done in a stoic manner. However, if you look to the right of the painting, you'll see the women, and you'll notice they're shown as anything but stoic. So I'd mentioned before that often the genders were used oppositionally. And here you'll see that's very, very true. The women are shown as the emotional counterpoint to the men's stoicism. However, I will say in their defense that they're either contemplating the loss of a brother, which would be very emotional, or a husband, because one of them is married to one of the Albans that have been selected for battle as well. So the idea that the Alban Romans, they've intermarried, but yet they're feuding, and that this one woman is going to pay the ultimate price. She either loses her brother or loses her husband. She cannot win. So I would say that these women have reason to be emotional in this case, but again, it's very much used as a counterpoint. The stoicism of the men to the emotion of the women, and even the way their body language is reinforces it. The men, you'll notice, are very angular and geometric. Their bodies make V's, which are very stable. What we call a figure triangle, literally. And then, the women's bodies are very curvy and biomorphic, right? And sort of, again, the difference is very clear when you look at the two bodies, the two sets of bodies, right? And the father's sort of there in the center as a dividing line, down the middle. But the idea that these brothers have been chosen to go sacrifice themselves to, potentially honor their family or lose for their family, and notice that they may be sacrificed, but their own personal journey, that's not important in contrast to what they're doing for their community. If you look at the setup of the painting, you'll also note it's a very logical setup. It uses Greco-Roman architecture, clothing, primary colors. It's a very organized scene. We can see everything very clearly. So it takes a bit, I think, from Renaissance thinking as far as the composition of the painting as well. So this is a very, very famous piece by David. You also can look at a work like Angelica Kauffmann's Cornelia Presenting Her Children as Her Treasures. And I like showing you Kauffmann's work because she was a woman working as a neoclassical painter. Now, I'm sure, first off, from our discussion of Gentileschi that women didn't really have an easy time getting into the arts. So there were very few women painters or sculptors or architects in general. Angelica, she was one of 2 female members of the Royal Academy of Painting in Britain. And it was considered quite an honor, of course, to be one of the 2 students out of, your student body. So women were being admitted to art schools at this time, but in very, very small numbers. So she did have an avenue for training, but again, I'm sure she had to fight a lot of battles to get what she needed as a student and as an artist as well. And when you read critics talking about her work, especially back towards the beginning of art history, 1700s, 1800s, when it really became a discipline, critics would often talk about her work as feminine, or they would kind of treat her a little bit differently, I think, than they would talk about David. And I think sometimes it comes down to things like, the fact that in this painting she used like the color pink, like she's a woman and she's using pink. But we'll talk about the symbolic use of that color and how, it's not really about her being a female painter. It's about what she's trying to say with the use of color. But again, I wanted you to think about the struggles that a female painter might have, even though is trained and becomes very popular. Like she's still going to have some issues being treated fairly or taken seriously in her field. This painting also comes from Roman history. It's a Roman story, and it deals with the Gracchi brothers, who were from the Republican Roman times. And in the history, they're referenced as like great governmental reformers. So you might wonder why we're here with them as children, because they're off to the left. The 2 brothers are off to the left. Why are we here with them as kids? Why are we not with them when they become these great governmental reformers? Well, I think what Kaufman was trying to do was she was trying to hit on that moral mother theme that we've come into contact with before, where she was trying to show that they grew up to be the great men that they grew up to be because they had the right role model. They had their mother. If you look at the way, Cornelia is presented, she wears white. She's pure. She's everything they need, right? She's a beacon. And you'll notice she's talking to this other woman who's holding up her jewelry. And that woman is dressed in red. She's wanton. She's a harlot, right? She doesn't have moral values like Cornelia does. She's only concerned with pretty things. And you'll notice that Cornelia's daughter is dressed in pink. And she's in between the 2 women, and she's looking at the jewelry even though she clasps her mother's hand. So I think what we're supposed to think about is this child will have to make a choice. Does she want to be vain and empty-headed and only interested in pretty things, or does she want to be like her mother? Does she want to be a moral beacon, someone who sacrifices for her children and her family, leads them on the right path? So I would say that the painting's about the Gracchi brothers, but it's really not. It's about Cornelia and what she did to make these 2 boys grow up to be what they will be. And some art historians wonder if she was kind of making some feminist commentary in this painting, because the women are shown, to me, very relatable, very realistically. And the boys, they seem kind of feminized, and the one seems like perhaps there's some medical issue perhaps involved. And so some people wonder if she's trying to kind of downplay the boys in favor of the girls a bit. And perhaps, I don't know. But it is an interesting rendering of the 2 boys who, again, this painting, Cornelia is saying, these are my children. These are my treasures. Because she's telling the woman, your jewelry is your treasure. These children are mine. So it's all about the morality of Cornelia's decision. So another famous neoclassical work. In the realm of architecture, I think that neoclassicism really shined. Especially if you think about America. We're at that part of the class now where, we do have people traveling to America to basically set up the country, right? Start the country's history. We have the American Revolution. We have all these events starting to happen. So we're going to have to turn our eyes, we've been mainly, really just obsessed with Europe. We're going to start turning our eyes and looking at American art as well and talking about how these movements also show up in America. Now, to be really clear about your timelines, these movements typically tended to show up in America about 40 to 50 years later, simply because of travel time. If you think about crossing the ocean by boat, that's what they had to do. So fashion, art, right, all that has to take its good, sweet time getting from Europe to America. It's like when I was younger and California fashion would take, like a good 5 years to make it to the East Coast where I grew up. So today we have no lag time, but we have to remember that up until quite recently, there was often lag time of something being trendy or in style and it showing up from place to place. So why is neoclassical architecture really popular in America? I think it's because it was a sort of a blank slate, but people didn't know what to do with it. And so they looked to what they understood had been viewed as classic and principled. And that was Greco-Roman stuff. You know, they said, okay, we need something that's going to communicate our seriousness of purpose. What can we use for that? And I think neoclassical art through the lens of Greco-Roman values, right, it just hit the spot for them. So you see the early fathers of America, like Thomas Jefferson, turning to neoclassicism. This, of course, is his famous House Monticello. He also used the architectural style for the University of Virginia at Charlottesville as well, so you can look at those buildings. But you notice it mimics the idea of a temple while using indigenous materials. By the way, the word indigenous means of the place. It's of that place. So when we say something's indigenous, we mean you can find it there. Well, why use brick? Because Americans didn't have marble. It's not indigenous, but brick could be made. It comes from materials indigenous to the area. So what I see American architects doing is they're taking the idea of the look of something Greco-Roman, but they're using what's available to them. So again, it looks like a temple, but with brick. What was the inspiration? Something like the Pantheon. So if you look at Rome and look at the kind of temples, or you look at Greece and look at the kind of temples you're seeing, and the reason I cite the Pantheon for this is because it has that famous dome over, right, the ceiling. So, you know, this was the kind of thing that someone like Jefferson was looking at and being inspired by. And it's intriguing because it's kind of like, you know, using things that are pagan for a society that's saying, you know, it wants to build one nation under God, you know, new sort of world order. So it's intriguing what we use as sources. You see neoclassical architecture also using Greco-Roman inspiration in Europe. You see it in British architecture. Here's the Adam piece, the Austerley Park House that I showed you when we looked at the Etruscan room. This is the exterior. So again, you'll notice you walk up to the house and you kind of go through what looks like, you know, columns supporting a Greek pediment, like you're entering into a temple. And of course, the room we already talked about. So again, it's interesting how these neoclassical pieces were used to inspire architecture. Finally, you know, you can look at how sculpture, right, is inspired by Greco-Roman values. And I'm showing you the sculptor Antia Canova. And to be technical, he was working mainly with Napoleon and his family. So this comes a little later in the timeline when some people suggest we're even getting into Romanticism, but I like these pieces. I want you to be able to see them and think about how, you know, to me they look much more neoclassical because of the way the subjects are styled. Pauline Borghese is Napoleon's sister, and knows that she wanted to be represented like the goddess Venus, which to me that's the neoclassical guise or, you know, disguise you're wearing, right? So again, I think this fits much more into the neoclassical values. It's intriguing to consider that the sister of such a powerful person, you know, the Emperor of France, wanted to be represented in this way. And notice the way that they deal with the nudity is sort of almost like airbrushing the breasts and not really making it look too scandalous, right, in nature. So I think that's the way they got around a little bit of the nudity issue. Here's Canova's rendering of Napoleon as Mars. If you really start to look at this stuff for too long, I think it almost becomes over the top. You know, almost like, you know, again, theatrical dress up in a way. So, but at the same time, you know, Canova is doing what his patron wants. You know, Napoleon wants him to pull from classical sources and use that as an inspiration. And this definitely mimics to me every great Greco-Roman sculpture I can think of. The contrapposto, the posing, the anatomy, everything about it really reeks, right? He holds out a Nike in his hand, very similar to how the Athena statue would have in the Parthenon at Athens. So Canova knew his source material for sure. And then the final sculptor I want to show you is Houdon, a French sculptor. And this is his rendering of George Washington. Now, right there alone, this gets interesting because it's a statue of George Washington, but it's done by a French sculptor. So the beginning of American art history, I would say, is kind of messy because you're dealing with, again, this migration of European style and value to America. And then the Americans kind of try to struggle with what is their identity? Do they want to take on these influences at all, or do they want to reject them? So there's this push and pull of influence and then rejection, I think, when you look at American art, especially in the formative days, right, of America. So it's interesting to consider. Houdon, though, I mean, he was a prominent sculptor in the neoclassical style, so he's a natural fit if you want a nice monument done for you, right? And George Washington, he's our father as a nation. So when Congress had this commission, they wanted something that was respectful. It was, elevated his status. They wanted something that they felt communicated the gravitas of George Washington as the father of the country. And this piece is actually modeled off of the Roman story of Cincinnatus. If you've ever wondered where the name of the city Cincinnati comes from, it actually comes from the Roman Cincinnatus. And Cincinnatus in the story is a Roman general who fights very hard for Rome and then basically wants to retire to his farm and be left, well enough alone. That he's a great hero, but he wants to move on to his private time, right? And if you have read the story of George Washington, he serves his terms and they want to elect him king or make him president in, perpetuity. And he's like, that's why we left England. We didn't want to have kings. It's not what we wanted for our government. We wanted to elect somebody and not have them grab and hold power for too long. We wanted it to be about constantly refreshing, and renewal. And he's like, I just want to go to my farm, hang out. I've done my duty to you people. So what Houdon does is he kind of includes things that reference Cincinnatus in the sculpture to let people think about this, like the column that Washington is leaning against sort of references this idea of like farming tools and such. His sword hangs along the side unused. So this idea of like somebody going out to pasture, rest and relaxation, but yet very honored, right, before they depart, right, before they leave the stage in a sense. So again, another, I think, great example of neoclassical sculpture. Now, sometimes neoclassicism goes bad, and we'll talk about that next.